has been focused on critiquing the hypersexualization of Afro-Ecuadorians, and are also therefore involved in rethinking the family and the racialization of that concept. It did not include indigenous activists, and that's an interesting story in itself. I went ahead too fast, but we have that in Ecuador, emphasis on the familias alternativas in the Constitution, and at the same time, part of that Constitution also states that marriage can only occur between a man and a woman. So on one hand, the right in that process won on same-sex marriage, but they lost on this expansion of the notion of the family, which most activists, in fact, were pushing more for that expansion of the family and not integration into the institution of marriage, because they see it as part of a colonization process and it's something that they want to think differently about. And that's very different from how activists in Argentina fought for same-sex marriage. They really mobilized, despite their differences, around the embracing of family and marriage as institutions that gays and lesbians in this case should have access to. So, the third example that I wanted to give was of the usage of urban spaces in new ways, and certainly gay pride marches is a wonderful example of the paradoxes that emerge from this. These are images from a pamphlet of the Gay Pride March in Caracas in 2008. And what's first interesting about this is that gay pride marches that are huge events in some cities, particularly in Rio and Caracas, or Mexico City, I would say, is that they're celebrated on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And so there's that whole globalization of the sexual rights struggle. And these marches have been, I guess, co-opted by governments, or offered to be managed by some governments, which is interesting in itself. So that has started to serve as this marker of national progress to support gay and lesbian rights, even when there are still criminalization laws on the books. But another aspect of this is certainly the use of public space, and this is occurring in cities. This is not occurring in rural areas. And there have been interesting debates on creating gay streets or neighborhoods in certain cities that have also created a huge backfire, because as we know from research in the US, usually gay neighborhoods are white and middle class, and there's a whole kind of gentrification process that goes along with that. That has raised all kinds of issues about inequalities within gay communities, and what I've seen thus far is the potential for reproducing those same kinds of inequalities. So one other aspect that I wanted to mention about this, going back to the issue of respectability and the way in which neighborhoods and communities play roles in shaping their own, respond to everything that I'm talking about here in terms of policies and laws, and how they themselves serve to discipline and shape who counts as part of a good family or a bad family, and so on. And again, this is partly what I addressed in my book on Ecuador in relation to women and families. But just, I think it's important to point out that neighborhoods and communities can serve as gatekeepers or negotiators of nation building, like these other actors, and that this idea of being part of a developing neighborhood or city or nation, or this idea of being part of a healthy neighborhood or city or nation, is one that's based on this dualism between heteronormativity between heterosexuality and homosexuality, in addition to other dualisms that have been discussed for a long time in terms of mestizo versus indigenous, or white versus black, or middle class versus poor, or urban versus rural. Certainly we think about the way in which the family that's often assumed and not explicitly discussed in these processes, we would have to think about how we ourselves discipline and construct even progressive community organizations, for example. I'm thinking of various kinds of urban social movements and organizations, and who ends up being involved and who doesn't, which is how I originally became interested in some of these questions. So just to conclude, I just want to, reiterate this idea that it's important to think about sexuality, and particularly heteronormativity, has been at the heart of modernization projects, something that certainly applies to the US as much as it does to any country. Particularly interesting, though, when we look at it through the lens of colonial and post-colonial studies and through development discourse, to think about how discourses of family survival and social respectability remain so incredibly strong that it is nearly impossible to have these discussions. Which is why I'm so excited that there are actually institutions like the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, various NGOs in the South, that are finally taking on the issue of sexual rights as a matter of survival. You know, and it's taken the death of several people and the very publicized spectacle of that to make this occur. But at the very least, people are beginning to make these connections. I would say that in non-Western contexts, this is another way of saying what I presented at the beginning. It's best to understand sexualities as constituted in and through projects that blur the boundaries between cultures, norms, and moralities. Indeed, I occasionally teach development studies classes in Ecuador, and I've also taught classes in Bolivia. And we've had these huge debates about how there's this authentic non-Western sub-theme out there. And so, of course, it doesn't help that I'm agreeing to have this debate, but I always say, okay, show me, take me there. And people can give examples of any rural village, and there are still influences of Westernization. And so for me, what is more interesting in the question is, the processes through which people identify themselves and their struggles, and situate themselves across these boundaries, so to speak, if that makes sense. That we're not talking, and with just one more example of that. People always say feminism or say homosexuality is Western. They never say that about Marxism. The last time I checked, Marx was not from South America. So it's really interesting how discourses get created that way, right? And certainly the urban-rural divide is huge. The example of Ecuador that I gave of how the indigenous movement has been really alienated from Korea's citizen revolution is a perfect example of that. One would have thought that the exact opposite would have happened. And again, just the idea that we need to think about these issues in the transnational context as well as, as opposed to perhaps a local versus global context.
Thank you.